The fluorescent lights of Riverside Market buzzed overhead as rain drummed against the windows, creating a melancholy symphony for what would become an unforgettable Monday morning. Dorothy Williams, 73 years old with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had witnessed decades of change, guided her shopping cart through the produce section with the deliberate grace that had become her hallmark over the years. Her arthritic hands, adorned with her late husband's wedding ring kept in place by swollen knuckles, trembled slightly as she reached for the last bunch of collard greens. These weren't just any greens. They were the cornerstone of her Sunday family dinners, a tradition that had kept her family united through 3 generations of trials and triumphs. The store was unusually crowded for a Monday, packed with people seeking shelter from the unexpected downpour. The squeaking of wet shoes against linoleum and the rustle of plastic produce bags created a mundane backdrop to what was about to unfold. Dorothy carefully inspected the leaves, her movements slow but purposeful, each gentle touch a testament to decades of cooking wisdom. That's when Karen Mitchell's designer heels click-clacked aggressively down the aisle. At 45, Karen cut an impressive figure in her tailored charcoal suit and perfectly styled blonde hair, though the humidity had begun to fray its edges. Her mascara, expensive but not waterproof, had left faint shadows beneath her eyes. The top realtor badge pinned to her lapel seemed to mock her recent string of failed sales. Their hands touched over the collard greens. Karen's recoil was visceral, as if she'd been scalded. Her diamond rings caught the fluorescent light as she jerked her hand back, sending water droplets from her rain-dampened sleeve scattering across the produce. The look of disgust that contorted her features transformed her carefully maintained appearance into something ugly and primal. "Don't you dare touch me." Karen's voice sliced through the ambient store noise like a blade. Heads turned. Phones emerged from pockets. "You people are always in the way, always taking what isn't yours." Dorothy's hand froze mid-air, her dignity a protective shield around her. But Karen was just warming up, her voice rising with each word, each syllable laced with generations of inherited hatred. The slurs came next, ugly words that had no place in 2024, but emerged from Karen's mouth like poisoned arrows. Then came the shove. Karen's manicured hand struck Dorothy's cart with enough force to send it careening sideways. Fresh produce tumbled to the floor, tomatoes rolling like wayward marbles, an orange bouncing off Dorothy's sensible shoe, those precious collard greens splaying across the linoleum like fallen soldiers. Dorothy, caught off guard, stumbled backward into the lettuce display. Water from the vegetable sprayers dripped down her back, but she remained upright, one hand gripping the display for support. The produce section had become a theater, with unwitting shoppers now forced into the role of audience. A young mother quickly covered her child's ears. An elderly white man in a veteran's cap shook his head in shame. A teenage cashier rushed toward them, work vest flapping, unsure how to handle this situation that no training manual had prepared him for. But it was the next moment that would change everything, the moment that would soon be replayed on news stations across the country. As Karen stood there, chest heaving with self-righteous anger, designer purse clutched like a weapon, Dorothy Williams did something extraordinary. She didn't scream back. She didn't crumble. She didn't even cry. Instead, she looked at Karen with eyes that held not anger, but something far more unsettling to someone filled with hate, understanding, and then, with the strength of someone who had survived far worse than a racist encounter in a grocery store, Dorothy Williams began to hum. The first notes of Amazing Grace floated through the produce section, soft but clear, carrying decades of hard-won wisdom in each syllable. And that's when Karen Mitchell's carefully constructed world began to crack. The melody of Amazing Grace hung in the air like morning mist, soft yet impossible to ignore. Dorothy's humming, barely above a whisper, somehow filled the entire produce section. Phones remained raised, recording what everyone expected to be another viral moment of racial confrontation. But this wasn't following the usual script. Karen Mitchell stood frozen, her anger momentarily short-circuited by confusion. A drop of rainwater mixed with mascara traced a black line down her cheek, a tear she hadn't intended to shed. The fluorescent lights caught the tremor in her hands, betraying the facade of strength she'd worn like armor. "Child," Dorothy said, her voice carrying the warmth of a southern summer evening, "you look like you're carrying something much heavier than these greens." She reached into her worn leather purse, the same one her granddaughter had given her last Christmas, and pulled out a clean white handkerchief embroidered with violet flowers. The simple gesture, offering comfort to someone who'd just assaulted her, caused a ripple through the gathered crowd. An elderly Asian woman nodded in recognition of the kind of wisdom that transcends cultures. A young black teenager lowered his phone, understanding he was witnessing something more important than a viral video. "Don't you dare patronize me," Karen spat back, but her voice cracked on the last word. Her designer purse slipped from her shoulder, hitting the floor with a thud that seemed to echo her crumbling composure. "You don't know anything about me or what I'm carrying." Dorothy bent slowly, her joints protesting, to pick up Karen's purse. A young stock boy rushed forward to help, but Dorothy waved him off with a gentle smile. "Sometimes," she said, straightening up with effort, "the heaviest things we carry aren't in our purses at all." She held out both the purse and the handkerchief, a peace offering in each hand. The overhead speakers crackled with a price check announcement, jarringly mundane against the tension of the moment. A child whispered too loudly to his mother, "Why is the nice lady being kind to the mean lady?" The question hung in the air, heavy with adult-sized truth. Karen's hands shook as she reached for her purse, accidentally brushing Dorothy's fingers in the process. This time, she didn't recoil. Instead, she stared at Dorothy's hands, worn by time, spotted with age, yet steady with purpose. These were hands that had likely changed diapers, wiped tears, and prepared countless meals. Hands that had probably endured decades of prejudice, yet still reached up to help. Karen started, her voice barely audible. A tear fell freely now, cutting through her perfect makeup like rain on a painted canvas. "I don't understand why you're not angry." Dorothy's response came with a slight smile, the kind that suggested she'd learned this lesson long ago. "Anger is a luxury I gave up in 1968, standing on the steps of Riverside High. Hate is too heavy a burden to bear, and I've noticed it weighs more on the person carrying it than on the person it's aimed at." The gathered crowd had grown silent, many holding their breath. The only sounds were the continued hum of the produce misters and Karen's muffled sobs as she finally accepted the handkerchief. She tried to wipe her eyes, but weeks of pent-up emotions had broken through her carefully constructed dam. Dorothy took a small step forward, close enough to speak privately despite their audience. "Now about those collard greens," she said, gesturing to the scattered vegetables at their feet. "I know a little cafe right here in the store that serves a decent cup of coffee, and it seems to me that both of us could use a moment to sit down." The invitation hung between them like a lifeline thrown into turbulent waters. Karen stood on the precipice of a choice: cling to her familiar hatred or reach for something different. Her mascara-stained fingers clutched Dorothy's handkerchief tighter, and in that simple gesture, the next chapter of their story began to unfold. The whispers spread through Riverside Market like wind through autumn leaves, as Dorothy and Karen made their way toward the cafe. Store employees and longtime customers exchanged knowing looks and hushed conversations. They weren't just witnessing a random act of kindness. They were watching history repeat itself in an unexpected way. Marcus Thompson, the store manager, stood rooted behind his customer service desk, his coffee forgotten and growing cold. At 45, he was no longer the angry 16-year-old who had once sat sullenly in Dorothy Williams' American literature class, but watching her now brought it all rushing back. His hands unconsciously touched the worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird he still kept in his office, the same copy she'd given him in 1994 when he was the only white student in her classroom. "That's Dorothy Williams," he explained to his young assistant manager, his voice thick with emotion. "First black teacher at Riverside High, back in '68. The day she walked through those school doors, there were hundreds of protesters. He paused, watching Dorothy's dignified posture as she guided Karen to a table. They threw rocks at her car, screamed horrible things, but she just kept walking, humming that same hymn you heard her humming just now. A small crowd had gathered around Marcus, hungry for context to the scene they'd witnessed. Among them was Sarah Chen, a retired nurse who'd worked at Riverside Hospital for 30 years. "Dorothy taught all 3 of my children," she added softly. But that's not even half of her story. During the hospital integration in the 70s, she volunteered in the pediatric ward. White parents would refuse to let her near their sick children at first. By the end of her shift, they'd be begging her to stay longer. The produce manager, Jerome, now in his 60s, stepped forward to start cleaning up the scattered vegetables. His movements were deliberate, respectful, as if handling sacred objects. My brother was one of the students who protested her arrival at Riverside High. He admitted, his voice carrying decades of regret. 2 years later, she was helping him apply for college. She told him, "Your past mistakes don't have to dictate your future choices." He's a judge now. Through the glass windows of the cafe, they could see Dorothy leaning forward slightly, listening intently to whatever Karen was saying. It was a posture familiar to generations of students and troubled souls who'd found themselves pouring out their hearts to her. "You know what made her different?" Marcus continued, unable to take his eyes off his former teacher. "She never treated hatred like it was permanent. She'd say, 'Hatred is just love that's lost its way home.' When the KKK burned a cross in her front yard, that first year of teaching, she put a garden around the scorched earth. Said she wouldn't let hate kill anything on her property. Those roses still bloom every spring." A young black teenager who'd been recording earlier approached the group, his phone now lowered. "My grandma said she was there during the '68 protests. Said Mrs. Williams would arrive an hour early every morning to clean the racial slurs off her classroom door, just so her students wouldn't have to see them. Never reported it, never complained. Just cleaned it up and taught her classes like nothing happened." Thunder rumbled outside, but inside the store, time seemed to stand still. Through the cafe window, they watched as Dorothy reached into her purse and pulled out what appeared to be an old photograph. Even from a distance, her face glowed with the same patient determination that had guided hundreds of students, comforted countless patients, and now sought to transform one more heart hardened by hate. "You want to know the real miracle," Marcus said, finally picking up his cold coffee. "She didn't just teach English. She taught us how to be human. And looks like she's still teaching." He nodded toward the cafe, where Karen Mitchell, the same Karen Mitchell who'd been the terror of real estate sales meetings and homeowners association gatherings, was wiping fresh tears with Dorothy's handkerchief, staring at whatever photograph had triggered this new wave of emotion. The lesson, it seemed, wasn't over yet. The cafe's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the worn photograph in Dorothy's hands, a black and white image of a much younger Dorothy standing beside a tall white man in a hospital bed, both smiling despite the obvious tension in their postures. Karen's trembling fingers traced the edge of the photo, her coffee untouched and growing cold. That's my father," Karen whispered, her voice catching. "Richard Mitchell." But how? The question hung incomplete in the air between them, like a bridge waiting to be built. Dorothy's weathered hand steadied Karen's shaking ones. "3rd floor, Riverside Memorial, 1989. Your daddy was my most stubborn patient during my volunteer years." A gentle smile played across her lips. "He came in spitting mad about having a black nurse's aide help him. Left 3 weeks later inviting me to Sunday dinner." Karen's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. The father she'd known. The man who'd taught her that some people were inherently better than others, who'd ingrained in her the importance of maintaining proper social circles, had kept this story buried, along with so many others she was beginning to suspect. "He never told me," Karen managed, mascara-stained tissues piling up beside her coffee cup. "The last few years, he started saying strange things. Telling me I needed to change, to open my eyes. but I thought the cancer was making him confused. Dorothy nodded, understanding flowing from her like a healing spring. Your daddy had a lot of regrets at the end. He called me, 2 weeks before he passed. Said he'd spent too many years teaching his little girl the wrong lessons. The cafe had emptied of other customers, giving them a bubble of privacy in the corner. Through the windows, curious shoppers pretended not to watch the unfolding scene, their own shopping forgotten. I'm losing everything, Karen confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. The inheritance taxes on Daddy's house are crushing me. The real estate market's dried up. My daughter Rachel, her voice cracked. She moved out last month, said she couldn't live with someone who carried so much hate. Dorothy reached into her purse again, this time pulling out her phone. A simple model her grandchildren insisted she carry. She pulled up a text message and turned it toward Karen. The message preview showed a young woman's face, strikingly similar to Karen's, with the caption, "Mrs. Williams, I don't know if you remember teaching me last year in your community writing class, but I need advice about my mom." Karen's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. "Rachel's been talking to you. She found me through the community center," Dorothy explained gently. "She had your fire, that girl, and your daddy's late-blooming wisdom. She doesn't want to lose you, Karen. She just doesn't want to carry the weight of hate anymore either." The armor that Karen had worn for so long, built from privilege, prejudice, and fear, began to crack like ice in spring. "I don't know how to change," she admitted, her voice small and lost. "I don't know who I am without all of this." Dorothy's hand found Karen's again, squeezing gently. Your daddy asked himself the same question in that hospital bed. Know what he discovered? That letting go of hate doesn't mean losing yourself. It means finding who you were always meant to be. A shaft of sunlight broke through the stormy clouds outside, casting a warm glow across their table. Karen stared at their joined hands, one weathered by age and wisdom, the other manicured but trembling with uncertainty. "The hardest chains to break," Dorothy continued softly, "are the ones we don't know we're wearing. But Richard Mitchell broke his, Rachel's breaking hers. Maybe it's time for you to break free too." Karen's next words came out as a mixture of a laugh and a sob. "Daddy's funeral is next week. I don't think I can face it alone." Dorothy's smile held decades of hard-won wisdom. Who said anything about alone? Sometimes the family you need isn't the one you were born into. It's the one that finds you when you're ready to be found. The rain outside had finally stopped, but inside, Karen Mitchell's careful walls continued to crumble, making way for something new to grow from the ruins. The cafe's clock ticked past noon as the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the lingering scent of rain. Dorothy and Karen's table had become an island of truth-telling, surrounded by the gentle hum of curious onlookers pretending to shop nearby. Their third round of coffee sat cooling, forgotten in the intensity of their conversation. "The recipe's simple enough," Dorothy said, writing in her flowing cursive on a napkin. "Collard greens, smoked turkey neck, onion, garlic." She paused, her pen hovering above the paper. "But the secret ingredient, the one that makes people come back for seconds, is time. You can't rush greens. They need to simmer, to break down slowly, just like healing." Karen traced the rim of her coffee cup, her designer blazer now draped over the chair, her professional facade stripped away. "I remember Daddy trying to cook after Mom left. Burned everything except cereal." A laugh escaped her, then caught in her throat. "He got so angry back then. At everyone. At everything. I thought that's what strength looked like." "Anger's just fear wearing a costume," Dorothy replied, setting down her pen. "Your daddy learned that in the hospital. Third day of his stay, he threw his breakfast tray at me." She chuckled at Karen's mortified expression. "Oh, don't look so shocked. By day 10, he was asking for my sweet potato pie recipe." A young barista approached with fresh coffee, her eyes wide with recognition from the earlier incident. But instead of tension, she found two women leaning toward each other like old friends sharing secrets. I don't know how to talk to Rachel anymore, Karen admitted, accepting the fresh cup with trembling hands. She sent me articles about privilege, about systemic racism. I got defensive, said horrible things. She swallowed hard, called her a traitor to her race. Dorothy's eyes held no judgment, only understanding. Let me tell you about my son Marcus. 1992, he came home from college angry at the world, angry at me for not being angry enough. Said I was an accommodationist. She smiled at the memory. I told him, baby, I'm not accommodating hate. I'm transforming it. Anger shouts so loud you can't hear change knocking. Outside the cafe windows, the supermarket had returned to its normal rhythm, but customers kept glancing their way, witnessing something rare and precious. A transformation happening in real time, over coffee and collard green recipes. How do you do it? Karen asked, her voice barely a whisper. How do you face people like me, without hating us back? Dorothy reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet, unfolding a worn piece of paper. My grandmother was born enslaved. She wrote this letter to her children in 1902. She smoothed the fragile paper carefully. It says, don't let them make you hate. Hate is their burden to carry. Your job is to prove them wrong by living well and loving better. Tears fell freely down Karen's cheeks now, her expensive mascara long since surrendered. I'm so tired, she confessed. Tired of being angry, tired of being afraid, tired of looking at people who don't look like me and seeing threats instead of just people. Dorothy finished gently. People who love their children, who worry about bills, who want their collard greens cooked just right. A watery laugh escaped Karen. God, I was horrible to you. Over collard greens, of all things. Child, I've been teaching longer than you've been alive. You think you're the first person to underestimate these gray hairs. Dorothy's smile held decades of hard-won wisdom. But here's what I know. The same fire that burns down bridges can be used to cook a meal that brings people together. It's all in how you use it. The cafe manager appeared with fresh cups and a plate of cookies. On the house, she insisted. As she walked away, both women could hear her whisper into her phone. Mama, you won't believe what I'm watching happen right here in our store. The cookies remained untouched as Karen leaned forward, her next words coming from a place of raw honesty. Teach me, please. Teach me how to unlearn what I've spent a lifetime learning wrong. Dorothy reached across the table, taking Karen's hand in hers. That's exactly how your daddy's story began too. The first video hit Twitter at 9:47 a.m. Shaky footage of Karen's initial outburst in the produce section. By 10:15 a.m., it had 50,000 views. But it was the second video, posted at 12:23 p.m., that changed everything. Dorothy and Karen in the cafe, holding hands, their heads bowed together in what looked like prayer, but was actually shared grief and understanding. This isn't how these videos usually end, commented a popular civil rights activist, sharing both clips side by side. Watch until the end. This is what courage looks like on both sides. Within hours, #GroceryStoreGrace began trending nationwide. In the cafe, oblivious to their viral status, Dorothy glanced at her phone as it buzzed continuously. Her grandson, a social media manager in Atlanta, had texted, "Grandma, you're trending on Twitter. CNN wants to interview you. Please check your messages." Karen's phone erupted too, but with a different tone. Her real estate office number flashed on the screen. The same office where she'd made casual racist remarks at company parties, where she'd steered clients away from certain neighborhoods with coded language. Her hand trembled as she declined the call. "I need to make this right," Karen said, straightening her shoulders. She opened her phone's camera, then paused, looking at Dorothy. Will you help me say what needs to be said?" Dorothy adjusted her chair, smoothing her skirt with the dignity of someone who had witnessed history being made and unmade many times. "Just speak your truth, child. The real one, not the one you've been taught to believe." Karen nodded, pressed record, and began. My name is Karen Mitchell. 2 hours ago, I assaulted an elderly black woman over collard greens at Riverside Market. But what happened next? Her voice caught, then strengthened. What happened next showed me who I've been and who I want to become. The video was raw, unedited, and undeniably authentic. Karen spoke about her father's secret transformation, her daughter's estrangement, and the weight of inherited hatred. She wiped tears openly, mascara staining her cheeks, her perfectly maintained image crumbling for all to see. Mrs. Williams didn't just offer me forgiveness. Karen continued, the camera shaking slightly in her hands. She offered me a way forward. To everyone I've hurt with my words, my actions, my prejudices, I'm not asking for forgiveness yet. I'm asking for the chance to earn it. Dorothy's quiet presence in the frame lent gravity to Karen's words. The video ended with Karen reaching for Dorothy's hand, their fingers intertwining. A simple gesture that spoke volumes. By sunset, the video had gone viral across multiple platforms, but unlike typical racial confrontation videos that sparked outrage and division, this one sparked something else. Hope. The comments section, usually a battlefield of racial politics, transformed into a space for confession and connection. I'm Karen. I've been Karen. But I don't want to be Karen anymore. Where do I start? Wrote one viewer. My grandma did what Mrs. Williams did for another white woman in 1963. History repeats, but sometimes in the best ways, shared another. News vans began arriving at Riverside Market as the story spread. Local station WRBX sent their top anchor, who happened to be one of Dorothy's former students. She approached with a microphone, then set it down and hugged her former teacher instead, crying on live television. The store manager, seeing the growing media circus, made an executive decision. He turned off the store's lights in a sequence that would normally signal closing time. Mrs. Williams, he called softly. There's a back exit through the loading dock. My car's waiting if you ladies want to avoid the cameras. But Dorothy shook her head, her hand still firmly holding Karen's. No more back doors, she said quietly. Years of history waited in her words. Some things need to be seen, need to be witnessed. Karen squeezed Dorothy's hand, understanding the magnitude of the moment. Together, they'd walk toward the store's front entrance, where cameras flashed and reporters waited. But the real story wasn't the media circus. It was the quiet revolution happening in one woman's heart, witnessed by millions, all because of a bunch of collard greens and the wisdom of an elderly teacher who never stopped believing in the power of transformation. 3 weeks after the incident, Karen Mitchell stood before her bathroom mirror, hands gripping the marble countertop. Her reflection showed subtle but significant changes. No designer suit, no perfectly styled hair, just a simple blouse and natural waves. Her therapy appointment card was tucked into the mirror's frame, next to a handwritten recipe for collard greens. Her phone buzzed with a notification. Grocery Store Grace Dialogue Series. Session 3 tonight, 7 p.m. She took a deep breath, remembering Dorothy's words. Healing happens in community, not in isolation. The community center's meeting room was already half full when Karen arrived. Faces turned, some still suspicious, others increasingly familiar. In the front row sat Marcus Thompson, the grocery store manager, beside Sarah Chen, the retired nurse. Both had become regular attendees of these weekly dialogues that Dorothy and Karen had started. Tonight's topic, Dorothy announced from her position in the circle, is inherited beliefs, what we carry and what we can put down. Her voice, warm as sunshine, carried to every corner of the room. And we have someone special joining us. The door opened, and Rachel Mitchell walked in, her steps hesitant but determined. Karen's heart stopped, then raced. Her daughter, so beautiful, so brave, had cut her hair short since moving out, a small act of rebellion that somehow made her look more like herself than ever. "Mom," Rachel said simply, taking the empty seat beside Karen. Their hands found each other, squeezing tight. Dorothy watched the reunion with quiet satisfaction before continuing. "Karen, Would you like to start us off?" Standing on shaky legs, Karen faced the group. "My name is Karen Mitchell, and 3 weeks ago, I was a racist." The words still burned, but truth had a way of cauterizing old wounds. "I'm not here to claim I'm cured. I'm here because every day, I find new layers of prejudice to peel away." The room held its breath as Karen turned to her daughter. "Rachel tried to tell me for years what I wouldn't hear. But sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom in the produce section to finally look up and see the light." Nervous laughter rippled through the room. A young black man raised his hand. "Ms. Mitchell, I saw your video. The real one, where you didn't make excuses. My uncle watched it too. He's never set foot in a room like this, but he asked me when the next meeting was." Sarah Chen spoke up next. "My son married a black woman 5 years ago. I haven't met my grandchild yet because of my own prejudices." Tears streamed down her face. "But being here, listening to everyone, I called my son this morning." The stories flowed like a river breaking through a dam. A white police officer admitted to racial profiling and his struggle to change. A black teenager shared his fear of shopping while being followed by security. A Hispanic mother spoke of teaching her children to be twice as polite, twice as perfect. Rachel, who'd been quiet until now, finally spoke. "When I left home, I thought I was giving up on my mother." She looked at Karen, tears shining in her eyes. "I didn't know I was actually giving her space to find her way back to humanity." Dorothy's phone lit up with another media request. The Today Show this time. She declined it gently, as she had declined most national interviews. Some transformations, she told Karen, need to happen away from the spotlight. The meeting concluded with their new tradition, sharing a meal together. Tonight's menu featured collard greens, Karen's first attempt at Dorothy's recipe. They weren't perfect, but that wasn't the point. The point was that people who 3 weeks ago would have avoided eye contact in the street were now passing plates, sharing stories, and building bridges across decades of divide. As Karen served a portion to Rachel, her daughter whispered, "I'm proud of you, Mom." Dorothy, overhearing, smiled. She'd seen many miracles in her 73 years, but watching hate transform into hope never got old. The grocery store confrontation had been just the beginning. The real story was what happened after, when people dared to sit together, eat together, and most importantly, change together. "You know what's funny?" Karen said later, helping to clean up. "I never did get those collard greens that day at the store." "No," Dorothy replied, her eyes twinkling. "You got something better." The autumn sun painted golden streaks across Riverside Community Center's new sign, Dorothy Williams Center for Reconciliation and Hope. Inside, the birthday decorations sparkled. 74 silver and purple balloons floated against the ceiling, each one representing a year of Dorothy's life journey. Karen Mitchell, wearing an apron instead of her once signature designer suits, stirred an enormous pot of collard greens in the center's kitchen. Her daughter Rachel stood beside her, checking the recipe card now stained with use and love. Their matching aprons read Grocery Store Grace, the name that had stuck after their story went viral. "More pepper, Mom," Rachel suggested, tasting the broth. Their easy kitchen dance spoke of months of rebuilt trust and healing. "Mrs. Williams likes it with a kick." The community center's main hall buzzed with activity. Sarah Chen arranged photographs on a display board, a timeline of the past year's transformations. There was the first grocery store Grace dialogue session, the community Thanksgiving dinner where former enemies broke bread together, the day they broke ground on the center's new wing funded by Karen's revitalized real estate career now focused on fair housing initiatives. Marcus Thompson, still the grocery store manager, but now also a regular speaker at reconciliation workshops, hummed the final photo, Dorothy and Karen in the produce section of Riverside Market, recreating their first meeting, but this time both laughing as they reached for the same bunch of collard greens. Sometimes, Dorothy's voice carried from the doorway, making everyone turn. The best recipes take a lifetime to perfect. She stood there in a royal purple dress, her silver hair crowned with dignity, her eyes bright with joy. Karen quickly wiped her hands and rushed to help her friend to her seat of honor, but Dorothy waved her off with a laugh. "I'm 74, not 100. Save your fussing for the greens." The room filled quickly, faces of every color, age, and background. The local news crew sat up quietly in the corner, working on their year-later follow-up story. Their previous coverage of the grocery store grace movement had won a regional Emmy, but more importantly, it had inspired similar programs in communities across 3 states. Rachel stepped up to the microphone, her confidence a testament to her own growth. "A year ago, my mother and I couldn't be in the same room. Now we can't imagine not spending Sundays together, cooking with the woman who taught us both that love is the best seasoning for change." Laughter and knowing nods rippled through the crowd. Karen joined her daughter at the microphone, her hand finding Dorothy's as she passed. "A year ago, I was known as the woman who had a racist meltdown over collard greens." She paused, letting the memory settle. "Today, I'm known as something else, a woman in progress, a mother reconnected, and most importantly, a student of grace." Dorothy's grandson wheeled out an enormous cake, its purple frosting matching her dress perfectly. But before the singing could begin, Dorothy raised her hand, asking for silence. "When I was a little girl," she began, her voice carrying years of wisdom, "my grandmother told me that hate is like a pot of bitter greens. It can only poison those who choose to keep tasting it." She looked around the room, meeting eyes that once avoided her gaze, but now sought her wisdom. "But love is like a good recipe. It multiplies when you share it, feeds more people than you'd expect, and always tastes better when served with grace." The room erupted in applause. But Dorothy wasn't finished. She motioned Karen and Rachel forward, pulling an envelope from her purse. "This center," she announced, "needs new leadership. I'm retiring." She pressed the envelope into Karen's hands. "The board voted yesterday. You two will co-direct the program starting next month." Tears flowed freely as mother and daughter embraced, their transformation from bitter enemies to partners in hope now complete. The cake waited, the candles flickered, and the collard greens simmered. But the real celebration was in the eyes of every person present, each carrying their own story of change, sparked by an encounter in a grocery store. "Make a wish, Mrs. Williams," someone called as she leaned toward her candles. Dorothy smiled, looking at the room full of restored relationships and renewed hope. "No need," she said softly. "It already came true."